Let me help you, Cora.
She wants me.
She wants me. I don't know why.
She wants you.
Yeah.
That was it.
All right. Does everybody have a handout this morning? No. I even put them by the bulletin this morning.
Well, that's the problem. I looked for him on that too.
So I threw you off. You didn't look at all. You just right by. See,
I remember standing back there.
well, you knew Justin would get it, right?
You're responsible.
Like the little. Okay.
You guys got yours?
No. I just did 2 times the amount of
This is like the little one. Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are. This is what they're going to be like when they get older. No, I want to do it.
I'm done.
Oh,
Oh,
I don't think I got
in the competition, I beat you.
He is a winner, but I was done first. That's all that matters.
At least they don't talk those Wednesday night little boys.
Yeah, little boys just do their job.
Just do it quiet. That's true.
What are you trying to say?
You're fired.
You're fired.
I'm gonna try. I didn't get one.
Well, after all that. All right, well, we are looking at faith. And so we, of course, did not have our study last week because we had Dale here, and I'm definitely glad Dale was here. It was a great week, learned a lot. It was definitely an encouraging thing to have him here. But we are looking at faith. And so we talked about faith 2 weeks ago, introducing 1 Corinthians 13, the end of chapter 13, and looking at what continues on and what are those 3 things. Faith, hope, and charity. That's right. That's the name of our quarter. Faith, hope, and charity. And so we're going to look at each one of those as we go through this quarter. And the one that we're focusing on now is faith. And so, of course, when we get to talking about faith, the chapter we're going to spend a lot of time in is Hebrews chapter 11. And it's really interesting that we did we did 5 cards last week. And then this week we've got 6 through 19 or 18. And it's all the different examples of Hebrews chapter 11. But you could spend a lot of time on each one of them and talking about their life. But as you've already noticed, as we go through this series, we've already looked at these people's lives. And we looked at the accounts. We've talked about them. We've talked about what they've done. But this is more focused on their faith. This is more focused on why they did what they did. And that's why they're here. In Hebrews chapter 11, we call it the Hall of Faith. But as you go through this chapter, you also see this. We always name it the chapter of faith or the hall. What is the word? Hall of Fame of Faith or the Hall of Faith. But it's also the Hall of Fame of obedience. And you notice that each one of these characters, each one of these men and women that lived under the Old Testament, they had a great faith, but their faith was coupled with obedience. And it's something that we're going to notice as we go through, and I think it's important to notice. And so this chapter begins with the description of faith and then provides many examples of faith to prove that without it, one cannot please God. And so that's kind of a summary of what we already looked at 2 weeks ago. But the New Testament chapter on faith is Hebrews chapter 11. So let's go to the first one, card 7. By faith, Abel. Somebody read Hebrews 11 and verse 4.
By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks.
Okay. Somebody read Genesis 4, 1 through 5 now also.
Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. He also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. The Lord respected Abel and his offering. But he did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry and his countenance fell.
Okay, so Dale spent some time last week looking at this account, and there's a lot here. What do we have? We have two men and offering sacrifices. What did Cain offer?
Grain offering, basically.
A grain offering, grain of the ground. Because what was Cain? I mean, what did he do? What was his trade? Yeah, he worked the ground. And so he took of the first fruits, the best of his crop, and he offered that to God. Now, throughout the Old Testament, do we see that example of first fruits a lot? Yeah. And what is the meaning of first fruits?
Best and first.
Yeah, it's that focus of being the best and giving God of what I produced first. And so it's not saying, well, I'm going to wait until something down the road. I'm going to give back to God last. I'm going to give God what I have first, and what I can give God the best. And so Cain had that right attitude, didn't he? But what did Abel offer? Of the flock. Why do you think Abel's, because he in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4 states that he offered a more excellent sacrifice. Why do you think that is the case? Because you look at both of them, they both had the right attitude, right? They both were giving of the first fruit. They both were giving of the best that they had. Why was Abel's more excellent? Did they both have faith? Yeah. Because what were they doing? They had faith. They were offering a sacrifice to God. Why was Abel's more excellent than Cain?
God to the exact point. I mean, exactly what he was told to do.
Exactly. Abel offered what God had required, and Cain did not. Did Cain have the right intentions in the sense of, I want to give God my first? He did. But Abel offered what God had required. And Dale talked about this in Genesis chapter 3. And when this Adam and Eve had covered themselves, what did God do to get rid of their shame? Made them coats. What had to happen for that to happen, for them to have coats? Something had to die. And throughout the whole Bible, all the way up to Christ, what has to cover sin? What has to be done to cover sin? A blood sacrifice. And so we know by what God had done in Genesis chapter 3 by setting the standard, and knowing that Abel's sacrifice was more excellent than Cain's, that Abel had faith, but he also coupled it with what? Obedience. See how it works together? Faith and obedience. Can we have faith today in worshiping God, but not have obedience? What does John 4 and verse 24 state?
John 4:24.
Yeah.
God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth.
Exactly. Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, and she stated that she didn't like the Jews because the Jews went down to Jerusalem to worship God, and they, as Samaritan, worship God in Mount Gerizim, or that area. I think Mount Gerizim, where they are at. And Jesus said, God desires those that worship him. There'll be a time where they do not go to a place to worship God, but they'll worship God in spirit and truth. What is spirit? It's not big S spirit, but little s. It's our attitude, right? It's our desire to want to worship him. God desires those that desire to worship him. God desires those that have the right attitude. Did Cain have the right attitude and desire to worship God? I think he did, didn't he? He wanted to offer a sacrifice, but then there's truth. What would truth represent? The right sacrifice. And for us, it is worshiping God the correct way that he desires. You think about today is being Easter. There's a lot of people. I noticed there's a lot more people on the road this morning. And I think that's because of what day it is, right? And so there's a lot of people having a desire, in a sense. Some may be doing it because they feel like they're forced, or they have to. But there is a lot of people worshiping God today in different places throughout the world. Are they worshiping in faith? I mean, do they have the faith? Do they have the desire to want to do that? But is everybody doing it the way God asked? God said? No. And so when we look at Abel and Cain, Abel had the more excellent sacrifice because he had faith with obedience. And therefore, God didn't have to state that he had the obedience in Hebrews chapter 11:4. He just states that Abel's sacrifice was by faith because it was more excellent. Because if it is according to the way God wants it done, then his faith was like God wanted. See, faith and obedience work together. We're going to see that through this whole chapter. You can have, and this is the idea today of this faith only. What is faith only? No works. You don't have to do anything. I just have faith in God. Does that work? Is that biblical? No. We're going to see that many times. This is an example of one that had faith and obedience. So Abel's sacrifice had faith coupled with obedience. And because of that, Abel was said to be righteous by God. In Hebrews 11 verse 4, though he had obtained witness that he was righteous. So by his actions, by his faith and his actions, he was found to be righteous in God's eyes. See how that works? That's the same for us today. We can have faith, but our actions, our works, will show our faith. And if we have our faith coupled with works, therefore we become righteous. Somebody read Acts 10, verse 34 and 35.
And 34.
Mm-hmm.
Then Peter opened his mouth and said, "In truth I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him."
Okay. Here, Peter states that God is no respecter of persons. What's that mean?
Nobody's any better than anybody else.
Nobody's better than anybody else. It doesn't matter what you are politically. If you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter what nation you're from. Everybody is the same in God's eyes. And everybody can be the same in God's eyes through their actions. Those that work righteousness can be accepted by God. And that's exactly what Abel did here. His actions, by working through his faith and his obedience, brought about an acceptance of God. And so here he's labeled as a man of faith. By faith, Abel offered to God. And so does it make a difference how you worship God? Now, this is not the only example of that. There's many examples. What's another big one you think of a person not offering or worshiping God in the way they should? And they happen to buy you? Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's many, exactly. I think of the next big one is they happen to buy you. And so God does care about our worship. And so we need to have faith coupled with obedience. And so hopefully we don't go to Hebrews chapter 11 and think this is just a chapter of faith and we're just looking at how they had a great faith in God. Their great faith was shown because of their obedience. And so it works together. All right, any questions on that one? On card 7. All right, card 8. By faith, Enoch. Somebody read Hebrews 11:5 now.
By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God.
Okay, and so Enoch. Somebody read Genesis 5:21 through 24.
And Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God 300 years after he had become the father of Methuselah. and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him.
Okay, so Enoch was taken. Does that mean he died? What does that mean? To be taken by God. Who was the other person to have this happen to him? Elijah. And a little different with Elijah. It was a little bit more grand display because Elisha's standing there and he sees this chariot of fire come out of the sky and come down and whisk Elijah away and take him into where God is at. And so Enoch and Elijah both were two men that were recorded. Now, is there others? We don't know. It's not recorded. But the only two recorded to have be translated to God is Enoch and Elijah. So what does the word translation mean? Well, when we think of translation, we think of a Bible translation. But what does that really mean, to be translated? Taken. It means to be taken from one place and put in another. And so the only way that Enoch was taken from one place and put into the other, which the other would be where God is, be with God, is because of his life, because of his actions. And so here it's stated that Enoch was taken away because of his faith. Does that mean that he had obedience too? Yeah, of course. And he was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. And so Enoch was a great man. He lived a life well-pleasing to God, to the point where God said, I'm going to just take him now. He's not going to see death. What does that imply if Enoch was taken and didn't see death? What does that imply for you and I? Is this life the end? When we die, where would Enoch gone? Mars. To Mars. Yeah. So there's that intelligent life that was on Mars, right? Yeah. So God took him somewhere. That means this life does not end. And it tells us that there is a life after our physical death. And Enoch is a display of that. And so is Elijah. And so it is proof that there is life beyond this life. He was moved from one place to another. Are we translated also? We're not translated in the same way that Enoch was, in that he was taken before he died into heaven. But somebody read Colossians 1, 12 through 13.
What did you say again?
Colossians 1, 12 through 13.
Giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who have delivered us from the power of darkness, and have translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son.
All right, so through Christ, we are translated to where? From where to where? From darkness to light. We are translated from darkness, which darkness represents evil, wickedness. A lot of times it can be talked about as this world. It's not talking about the physical world. It's talking about the sin, the wickedness, the evilness of this world, and anything outside of God, away from God. And so through Christ, we are translated, which means we're moved from that position to a different position. What is that position? The kingdom, into the church. And so translated. Do our actions bring about that translation? Can our actions bring about that translation? Yes. When we do as we're supposed to do, and we follow that plan, we are translated into his kingdom. And so Enoch was an example of one that was translated into God. So because of Enoch's faith and obedience, he didn't see death. Somebody read Amos 3 and verse 3. Amos 3 and verse 3.
Can two walk together unless they are agreed?
Okay, so think about that. The reason I put this verse in there. Think about that. Can two walk together unless they agree? What does that say about Enoch since he walked with God?
Agreed.
They agreed. That means they worked together. They were one that was, Enoch was doing what God required. He was pleasing to him. And so that's the same thing that we desire, right? I would love to be able to have that said about me, that I walked with God in my life. That's what we strive to be. And so just like, we talk about David was considered to be a friend of God. That's something I would like to be said about me also, as I was a friend of God. And so Enoch was one who walked with God. And so, all right, that's card 8. So by faith, Enoch. So let's do card 9 now. So by faith, Noah. Well, what did Noah do? Built an ark. Somebody read Hebrews 11 and verse 7.
By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith.
Okay. Noah is a great example of faith. And when we're talking about faith, and we're not talking, as we've stated many times, faith is not just faith. It's got to be coupled with obedience. And that's exactly what we see with Noah. Noah had a great faith. Noah shows the proper relationship between grace, Genesis 6:8, faith, Hebrews 11:7, and then also somebody read Genesis 6:22.
Thus Noah did, according to all that God commanded him, so he did.
Okay, so Noah did everything. Now, we don't have time to read Genesis 6 through 9, but in Genesis chapter 6, what did God tell Noah to do? To build an ark. His faith, and so we get to Genesis 6 and verse 22. He did everything God required of him, right? And so he had faith. Now, what does it mean for Noah to have faith? What did he have faith in?
God.
He had faith in God. He also had faith in what God told him, right?
It's not like it. He built it and it came the next day. It took a while.
It took a long time. 120 years. God numbered man's days 120 years. So you have 120 years where Noah is building an ark. What do you think people were saying to him over that period of 120 years? Yeah, what in the world are you doing? You're crazy. Somebody read Genesis 2, verse 1 and 2, and then verse 5. I know I have a lot of extra that you guys don't have on your paper. This is one of those weeks it's hard to get everything on 2 pages.
Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. And then
Verse 5.
before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground.
So God had not caused it to rain on the earth. Dale did a great job. He was using the board, talking about what the earth was like during this time. Does anybody remember what he talked about? What was below the land? There was water, right? There was water under the deeps. What was above the atmosphere? Water. And so it was kind of a greenhouse effect. That's what we're all scared of, saying that global warming, we're getting back to this greenhouse effect. Well, that's what the earth was like at that time. And so you had all this water above. And what happened was there was a dew that would come every morning and water the plants. And so at this time, they had not seen rain. They had not seen flood. Did Noah have trust in God? When God tells him that man's days are numbered to 120 years. I'm going to send the flood to destroy the whole earth. That took faith, didn't it? He'd never seen it. And so here is a man who has to spend 120 years building a boat that he's never had to use before, and trusting that God is going to do what he said. And so he does. He spends 120 years. No matter what, with all the people that are saying he's crazy, what are you doing? Did they change their minds once the door was shut? They did. They understood at that point. Noah had faith. He had truth, and he acted upon that. Somebody read James 2 and verse 24.
You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only.
Okay, man is justified by works, not faith only. That's James chapter 2, or a section of James chapter 2. It's talking about faith without works. And so James tells us, show me your faith without your works, I'll show you my faith by my works. That's exactly what we're seeing in Hebrews chapter 11. It's faith with works. And Noah is a perfect example of that. Because if he believed that God was going to send the rain but didn't build the ark, what would happen to him? He would have died with everybody else, and things would have been a whole lot different. He had faith with his works. And so Noah was a just man and perfect in all his generations, and he found that favor in the sight of God. That's Genesis 6, 8 through 9. But in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, I want us to notice a couple things here. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear. What does it mean to have godly fear? It says it moved him. How did it move him?
Because he believed it was going to happen. God said it was going to happen. He just knew it was going to happen.
Yeah. He trusted in God. He was moved to do something that he was divinely warned of that he had not seen. Is there something that we are divinely warned of that we have not seen? Eternal life, the judgment day. How many were warned many times that this life is not just this physical life, that we're not going to just live for 80 years, whatever the normal age is, average age for a person, live 80 years, 90 years, 100 years, and then this life is over. We've already seen Enoch was translated with God. He never saw death. Therefore, Enoch is with God in a place that is eternal because he has an eternal soul. God gave us an eternal soul, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 22. And so therefore, if we have an eternal soul and we are been divinely warned that there will be a judgment day someday and we need to be prepared, shouldn't that motivate us to move with godly fear? The same way. Noah moved with godly fear by something that God warned him of, and we should do the same. So his actions was he prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heirs of the righteousness which is according to faith. So Noah acted, he moved, and he prepared the ark so that he could save himself and then also his family. When we're motivated by godly fear because of what we're warned of, that this life is not it, that if we are not saved, we'll not be in eternity with God. We act upon that by saving ourselves, by being translated into the church. And that's going right back to Enoch. And so Noah is a great example of a man who had faith and was motivated to be obedient. And so because of that, he was found to be righteous. All right. Any questions on that one? I know we're not spending a lot of time on each. We've got a lot of cards to get through. Card number 10. By faith, Abraham. Somebody read Hebrews 11 and verse 17.
By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that received the promises offered up his only begotten son.
Okay. So Abraham was by faith offered up Isaac. Almost everything in the life of Abraham was an example of faith. What are other examples of Abraham's faith that we see? Somebody read verse 9 and 10.
By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God.
Okay, Abraham was given a promise in Genesis 12, verse 1 through 3. What are those promises? There's 3 promises. Promise, land promise, and the nation promise. And so those 3 promises, did Abraham see those promises fulfilled in his lifetime? No. He saw the seed as in his son being born, Isaac. But did he see a great nation come from him? No. He didn't see them taking the land and acquiring the land that God had promised. Here he was told to go to a land that God would give him. But what did Abraham do that whole time of his life while he was in Canaan, or the land of Israel?
Kept the faith.
Kept the faith. He dwelt in tents, right? What does that mean if you're living in a tent?
You don't have a permanent home.
You don't have a permanent home. It wasn't until the Israelites, 430 years, left Israel, wandered through the wilderness for 40 years, went into the land and acquired it before they actually settled and acquired that land that was promised to Abraham. But Abraham had faith that God was going to do that. And so Abraham, everything in his life was an example of faith. And then we get to the card here and talking about Isaac. The willingness to offer Isaac to God as a sacrifice was the greatest proof of Abraham's faith. When we read this account, we look. When we sit down and read this account of Abraham offering his son as a sacrifice to God, we think about that and go, why would he do that? Why would God require him to do that? What did Abraham do? What was his thoughts through that? Let's go to Genesis 22. This is the account of it, Genesis 22. Let's look at a couple things.
Especially since he had that promise of the seed, and then it seemed kind of contrary.
You're right. You're right. He had a promise of a son, and he finally had his son. His son's about 13 years old at this point. And God tells him, somebody read verse 1 through verse 3.
Abraham's faith confirmed, is that right? Yep. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him.
Okay, so first verse, what is God doing to Abraham? He's testing him. He's testing his faith. And so he tells Abraham, take your son, your only son. He's only had one. That's the son that he's been promised, is Isaac. And he says, go up in the mountain, sacrifice your son. What does Abraham do? Verse 3. Abraham what? He obeys. He rose up early. When you're rising up early, you're planning to do something, right? Not everybody wants to get up early in the morning just to get up early in the morning. I know some people that just happens, but most of the time you rise up early because you have an agenda. You have something you're going to do. And Abraham didn't question God. He didn't say, no, I'm not going to do that. He rose up early, that 3-day journey. Do you think in that 3-day journey he could have changed his mind? He could have and walked away and came back. But he did that because of his faith. And so he goes up, and you can read through the whole account, which we don't have a lot of time to do. But Isaac, his son, puts the wood on his back. They start to go up. Isaac, what does Isaac ask?
Where's the offering?
Where's the offering? And Abraham says, God will provide. He goes up onto the mountain. He binds his son. He builds the altar. He binds his son, puts him on the altar, raises his hand to kill his son and slay his son. And what does God do? Sends an angel to tell him to stop. And then they turn and look, there's an offering that they offer. And so we look at that account and we see that Abraham had great faith. What was his faith? We'll go back to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17 and read what Abraham was thinking. And read through verse 19. Hebrews 11, 17 through 19.
By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure, received him back.
Okay, so Abraham concluded that God was able to do what? Raise him up from the dead. He knew that even if he went through with it and killed his son, that God was able to raise him up. And it's stated here that Abraham already had sacrificed Isaac. How is that?
Had it in mind to actually do it.
He had it in his mind to do it. He had already made the decision in his mind, I'm going to go through with this. And he knew he was going to do it. And so God knew that. God knew his thoughts, and God stopped him from doing that. And so Abraham displayed his great faith in God by trusting in God. So we have faith, obedience, and trust. He had faith in God, that God would take care of him and raise him up. He trusted God would do that. And then he obeyed God by going through exactly according to everything God said to do. Now, the last part of verse 19, it stated that this was a figure. Well, Abraham and Isaac is a figure. You've heard of a type and an antitype. Well, a type is like if I'm standing here, if you're looking out in the aisles here, you can see a type is the pew. What's the antitype? It's a shadow. See the shadow. And so this is a type and antitype. This was a figure of what God was going to do. What does John 3:16 say? God offered his son. Isaac did not have to die. Abraham did not have to go through with it, even though he knew he was going to do it, and he had already made up in his mind he was going to do it. He didn't have to. What did God do? God went through with it. He offered his only son for you and I. But what did God do? After he died, he raised him up. And so there's a lot. I mean, you could spend a long time on this account, but there's a lot of type and antitype here. And then there's a type and antitype with us. Romans chapter 6, verse 3 through 6. We die, we're buried, and we rise again. And so there's a lot with that. But by faith, Abraham did exactly what God had told him to do.
Something about Isaac's too. I know there's a lot more, but he also believed, trusted. Think about how Abraham taught Isaac, to trust him.
Where did Isaac learn that from? It's from Abraham, his father. And you don't see Isaac struggling. You don't see Isaac saying, no, don't do this to me. What are you doing? He understood. When they were going up there with no sacrifice, he understood what was going on. But Isaac willingly went through with it, which is another type and antitype. Did Christ willingly go to the cross? He did. He willingly went to the cross for us. And so Abraham is described as a friend of God. Somebody read James 2 and verse 23.
And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God.
So because of his righteousness, because of his faith, and because of his obedience and trust, he was called a friend of God. And the father of them that believe, Romans 4 and verse 11. And so offering of Isaac is used by James to show the relationship between faith and works. And I'd encourage you to read James 2 and look at what faith and works entails. And James uses Abraham as an example here because of his great faith with his works. Let's just do that. Let's do James 2, 21 through 24. We're almost out of time. James 2, 21 through 24.
Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you not see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only.
Okay, so Abraham is used. He was justified by his works. But notice verse 22. It said, "You see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect." His faith was made perfect because of his works. Our faith is made perfect by our works. We can all have faith. We can believe that there is a God, but our faith is not elevated to perfection unless we have works coupled with it. And so that is the theme of Hebrews 11. And each one of these examples has that same attribute. It's faith and works coupled together. So anybody got any questions? We're out of time for class this morning. Nothing? All right. Thank you guys for your time this morning.
Where did Enoch's body go?
It doesn't tell us. It said he was taken up with God. So I'm guessing.
Soul went up.
Well, his body disappeared with it.
Yeah.
So, don't know.